let's carry on with the afternoon session. Now, the fourth session of today is on climate and sustainability. We will be focusing on this extremely important topic, and joining us will be Dr. Shamshad Akhtar, who will be delivering a keynote address. Now, Dr. Shamshad Akhtar is a seasoned professional, having worked in the multilaterals, including the Asian Development Bank. She has also served as Governor State Bank of Pakistan and twice as Caretaker Federal Minister of Finance and Revenue. She is currently the chairperson of the Pakistan Stock Exchange and Pakistan Institute of Corporate Governance. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome her to the stage.
Assalamu alaikum. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Thank you, Asfar, as usual, for organizing a brilliant, diversified event. It's really an honor to be addressing the events that you organize. They're very stimulating, thought-provoking, and presumably this advocacy will have an impact on everybody who's out here, because we're all involved in different ways in our community. So I'm going to be very simple in my overview because I have a brilliant panel who will do all the innovative talking. Climate finance is a major enabler for climate action, as you all know. The global green and resilience investment needs are enormous, almost 10 trillion US dollars are required annually, would be required annually from 2030 onwards. And present demand is also pretty steep globally. A quarter of that needs to be mobilized for least developed countries and emerging economies. So you need more risk capital or concessional financing for climate. Global climate ambitions need to scale up both concessional as well as non-concessional to finance capital investment into the transition and sustainability, because it will generate higher returns both in value terms as well as in dollar terms. And also, we need this funding to meet liquidity needs to enhance resilience against escalating climate impacts. COP29, the climate summit hosted by Azerbaijan in November 2024, is expected to set the new bar of climate finance. It's a new qualitative, collective climate finance goal for which seeds had been sown a bit earlier. Delivering such a goal is a formidable challenge and require political commitment and changes in the international financial architecture so that the required investment, financial flows, and instruments for climate action, and also just mutual contributions are mobilized, but would require a robust governance and transparency framework across international corridors, but also domestically. My first point is the enormity of Pakistan's climate challenge, moving from the global scene to the domestic scene. This challenge is overwhelming. Pakistan is a frontline state and most climate vulnerable country with high risks that impacts every segment of the economy and all stakeholders. Not all the cost is accounted for, given our statistics are full of all kinds of challenges. Pakistan's climate faces a rate of warming significantly higher than the global average, with growing climate variability and extreme events that reduces water availability, severe and longer droughts, accelerated glacier melt, more variable and intense monsoons accompanied by floods and landslides, and sea level rise encroaching on coastal settlements and infrastructure. The whole of South Asia is facing this challenge, and we are in midst of a very adverse political environment, so we cannot even have a mutual cooperation. ASEAN is outstanding in this context. The negative macroeconomic consequences of climate and weather-related disasters have induced close to $29.3 billion in economic losses over 1992 to 2021, which is equivalent to about 11.1% of 2022 GDP, and large development outlays are required as urban planning, infrastructure, water resource management, etc. State is extremely weak. So we need to invest heavily to uplift our infrastructure and modernize to be climate resilient. The ND Gain Index has ranked Pakistan as the 27th least ready country in the world to address the impacts of climate change. The poor, of course, are the most vulnerable lot. And this is also because they are reliant on very sensitive and vulnerable sectors like agriculture, livestock, fisheries, forests, and groundwater. Now let me turn to another area, which is really the enormity of fiscal risks associated with climate change. By a conservative estimate, the fiscal burden of climate-related physical and transition risk is close to could be anywhere from 1.2 to 4% of GDP, and I have seen higher figures also being floated around. Understanding fiscal risks is critical for provisioning for physical and transition cost, including repair, replacement cost for damaged infrastructure, and disruption cost of vulnerable sectors, and for investing in financial resilience against climate and natural disasters. And we also need investments in adaptation and mitigation. As Pakistan enacts policies, and it has been very slow to transition to a low carbon economy and move towards its NDC compliance, which is already not all that ambitious, sectors dependent on fossil fuels can be negatively impacted. This could lead to lower revenues from these sectors, which means that we would have less funding to fund the climate. It's ironical because you really need to raise resources for climate finance. IMF's dynamic investment growth and natural disasters model that analyzes the impact of public investment on growth and debt under various climate shock scenarios shows that if an additional 1% of GDP per year is invested in adaptation, infrastructure over and above the baseline public investment, the negative deviations of GDP, private consumption, and private investment from the steady state following the shocks are about 1/3 to 1/2 relative to the baseline that we are facing, scenario that we are facing. And of course, I have to next move to the Pakistan's climate finance gap itself. We have discussed the enormity of the challenge both at the global level and domestic level, but there is also this huge climate finance gap at present. Total investment needs for a comprehensive response to Pakistan's climate challenges between 2023 to 2030 is estimated to be around 348 billion, a figure which I'm sure everybody who works on climate is very familiar with because it's a World Bank estimate. This is about 10.7% of cumulative GDP for the same period. This consists of 152 billion or 44% of adaptation and resilience and 196 billion, 56% for decarbonization, which is absolutely needed across the economy. Pakistan's mitigation financing goals are pegged to the ambitious goal of reducing projected emissions by 50% by 2030. By adopting 60% of energy mix from renewable sources, this is moving pretty okay in my view. By targeting, of course, also 30% of new motor vehicle sales to be electric vehicles by 2030, and by banning imported coal. These are very noble objectives for a country like Pakistan, in my view. At the same time, Pakistan's adaptation focuses on agriculture sector, which contributes 20% of the GDP, its natural capital in terms of forest, water systems, coastal resources, and air quality, as well as its infrastructure, which is 55% of contribution to GDP, and its human capital, particularly in the area of health and education. The 2021 climate finance value represents a staggering 12 multiples gap versus the average annual total climate finance needs until 2030. Given Pakistan's population, its climate financing flows, and hence the gap stands at an adverse position versus other African and Asian countries. And you will be surprised to hear that G20 today is not supporting Asia in climate finance struggle. It's supporting Africa at the G20 level, because I'm personally involved in a group that is doing the debt simulation as a consequence with various scenarios in terms of the shocks of the climate, and everything is being discussed in G20 platform, which means external resources will come through, because if G20 agrees, then the other donors also galvanize around that. So let me turn to another main point I wanted to discuss, which is the imperative of raising domestic private finance for climate action. So far, we've talked about the international and then domestic, which by and large, I was talking about public sector. Pakistan's financing composition profile is distinct and skewed in terms of sources and objectives. For example, in 2021, the share of public climate financing was 69% versus 31% from private. Hence the need for galvanizing private, and some of our panelists are doing a great job to galvanize the private financing, and you'll hear about it. And of course, the share of climate financing was 84% versus 16% of the domestic resources. Domestic private financing share of Pakistan's climate financing at 5% lags the international and regional benchmarks. Let me talk a little bit about local investors, and this would be my last point. The most significant challenge here is that of credit risk and long-term tenure of climate projects and risks of defaults and losses, and lenders hence have shied away from the low perceived potential for profits and benefits of financing green products, and long-term nature of these projects does not fit the business model of most banks, thereby limiting participation by the domestic private sector. And hence, you will see the action of private sector, how it is able to leverage the requirements from the private sector. If financial institutions are to successfully navigate the complexity of transition finance and maximize the associated opportunities, they need to embed the right mechanisms and processes into their operating models and activities, as well as their focus has to be to target real economy transition, setting targets and metrics for decarbonization, and monitoring it rigorously with pre-agreed targets. We also need to focus on setting the right incentives, using internal levers such as capital allocation, adjusted risk appetite to create the right set of incentives for parties to deliver on the transition, such as incentivization through subsidized input costs to climate tech solutions for urbanization, energy efficiency, water, agriculture, and development of transition finance capabilities and of emerging technologies. We also need to invest in innovating new products, such as in-house transition finance frameworks, robust controls around the scaling up transition funds and bonds, minimize greenwashing risk, promote blended finance solutions with specialized guarantee and insurance mechanism. Corporate legislation and regulations is critical, but it ought to be accompanied with full corporate guidelines, and possibly there has to be the best practices. The challenges in climate finance emerge from weak governance. The Climate Change Act of 2017, and this is where our public sector has failed us, has offered undoubtedly the legislative framework and backing for climate governance institutional arrangement that mandates establishment of climate change authority, which is supposed to lead the adaptation, mitigation, and coordination across the country, which is supposed to secure international finance and fulfill Pakistan commitments to international conventions, treaties, and agreements so that we are credible internationally. Establish Pakistan Climate Change Fund. Not only has the Climate Change Authority not been operationalized in a real sense, but the development of the Climate Change Fund has yet to require clarity and transparency. The Act mandated establishment of Climate Change Council, an apex body making under the Office of Prime Minister and with representatives from major federal and provincial governments and the Natural Disaster Management Authority and Climate Change Authority. It has been done, but the noise coming from the system is that it's not that effective. There are different climate finance units with overlapping responsibility, and most operate in silos. with lack of systematic prioritization and coordination with relevant ministries and alignment of activities with national strategies and climate roadmaps. Pakistan has to compete with other regional and developing economies for global climate, particularly concessional finance. And as such, we need to be moving swiftly in getting our act together and developing a pipeline of projects that any donor or investor could grab it and move forward to actually implement. Pakistanis mobilize developing country opinion within the G77 and has persuaded developed countries counterparts for loss and damage fund at COP27, if you recall. At COP29, Pakistan can mobilize consensus on how to scale climate finance ambitions, get the money out quickly and make it work, but before that, have a developed pipeline. We have to offer donors to leverage our climate initiatives for managing our debt burden in an effective manner, because no matter who's saying what here, our debt burden will remain pretty high. So there are lots of learning from the neighboring countries as well as internationally. So Pakistan is not the only country that is facing some of these challenges, but it's good to get out there and grab the opportunities and compete aggressively for the funding. Thank you. Thank you, Aswa.
Thank you, Dr. Shamshad Akhtar. What an impactful address, and I think we can all truly agree we need to enhance resilience about climate impact and climate financing. And we need to invest in this space, and regulation should support this.